I've been involved in what I call climate finance impact investing for almost 10 years now. But my career, I believe, is quite well suited to that experience based on the fact that I spent almost 20 years in investment banking. And then I spent 9 years at the Development Bank of Southern Africa, where I was very fortunate to be put in a unit called the Product Innovation Unit, which at the time initiated the whole change in the DVSA to be far more climate-minded. And during that time, I worked on a number of financial structures, financial approaches that were relevant to climate finance and impact investing. I then retired from the DVSA about 3.5 years ago, and since then I basically wear what I call 2.5 hats. The one is that I am a senior advisor and Africa representative for CPI, Climate Policy Initiative, where we've just opened an office in Cape Town, in fact in May this year. So that's the one hat, and the other is that I do some work for MEGA, for the World Bank, with a particular focus on Southern Africa. And then as I call it, my half hat is the fact that I chair the advisory committee for the Green Outcomes Fund. So it's a combination of investment banking and development finance, but with a specific emphasis on climate finance and impact investing over the past, as I said, almost 10 years. So I need to differentiate between CPI and the lab. So the lab, which is called the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, was established by CPI. And in fact, it's the 10th anniversary of the lab, as we call it. And CPI is in fact the secretariat for the lab. So CPI as an entity does much more than just the lab, although it's probably best known for the lab. It very much drives policy and funding for businesses, governments, and financial institutions, with a focus on economic growth and climate, or preventing climate change. So that's CPI. We have around 160 people now in 7 offices around the world. The ones that are sort of in the emerging markets include Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa. So that's the sort of CPI. As I said, we do a lot more than just the lab. As far as the lab work is concerned, as I said, we set up the lab. The lab is very relevant in that over the past 10 years, excluding the current cycle of 10 instruments, we have helped develop and endorse 68 instruments. And those instruments have catalyzed close to $4.5 billion of climate finance. So, that is the sort of overall success of the lab. About 60% or just under 60% of those instruments are implemented. I mean, you're never going to get 100% implementation. But I think that's what the success of the lab is, and that's why I think the lab continues to be relevant, is that it does catalyze climate finance into the sort of what we call the developing markets. So the instruments it's a very interesting concept. So we work on what we call annual cycles. So we have a call for ideas. It goes out in November every year. We get approximately 240 applications. And from that, we whittle that down to anywhere between 6 and 10 instruments. So this year we have 10 instruments, which we then approve for support. Then what happens from about February, and very interestingly, we're having the Africa Advisory Committee meeting at Aegis this year, which for the first time will be in person at Aegis. And basically what will happen is the advisory board, which is made up of independent financial institutions, they will vote on the instrument or instruments to support for the next year. Then from beginning of March till Climate Week, which is in September, the CPI will allocate resources to help the proponents of these instruments take them from what we call concept stage, because they've arrived in a concept stage, through the development phase and then ready for implementation. As far as the partners are concerned, you could go onto the website, you'll see that we probably have close to 80 institutions that are members of the advisory boards of the lab. And when I say the advisory boards, so we have country advisory boards like Africa, Brazil, India, and then we have the global advisory committee. So those are very much the partners. So on one hand, you've got the proponents of the instruments. On the other hand, you've got members of the advisory board. And we work very much on a sort of democratic process. So they are the ones that effectively choose the instruments for development. And then, of course, you have CPI, which is the sort of the glue between the two. So it's very interesting that we've seen the development or the increase in climate finance. Unfortunately, it's not spread evenly. So, for example, Africa, unfortunately, sees a lot less climate finance than perhaps some of the other continents. But it's become far more relevant and far larger in amount because of the stakeholders involved. So what's happened is, if you start at the very bottom, okay, those are people who invest in pensions or have their assets managed through asset managers. They are now insisting that their money does good. So let's say the contributors to the pension funds, to the asset management funds, are now putting pressure on the fund managers and the pension funds to invest in impact-related investments, which includes obviously climate. So that's on one hand. Then the other pressure that is coming from the shareholders. So the shareholders, a lot of these organizations, they are in turn putting pressure on the asset managers, the pension funds, to invest in what we call good. And then there's people within the organizations themselves who are becoming far more conscious of the need to provide funding to prevent climate change or to manage climate change. So I think it's very much those components that influence the increase in the amount of climate finance that we're seeing. It's clearly not enough, but if you look at the growth over the last few years, it has been enormous. As I said, unfortunately, a lot of that climate finance has not made its way into the emerging markets, and in particular Africa. So climate finance is divided into two, what we call mitigation and adaptation. So think of energy as mitigation and things like water and waste more of adaptation. So I don't think there's a limitation on sectors. I mean, it goes across transport, water, energy efficiency, waste, so it's not the sectors per se, but it goes down to what we call the ability to generate cash flows, okay, to offer a return on the investment. So clearly mitigation, which is energy, you'll have far more dependable cash flows. So you take, for example, the REAP program in South Africa is now almost entirely funded by the private sector. There's very little concessional funding in there because let's call it the cash flows are well established. When it comes to other sectors, like transport, water, waste, the cash flows are not the same. So that's where concessional finance plays a much greater role. So it's not necessarily sector specific. I think you've got to look more at the sector itself, and I think the dynamics, particularly the financial dynamics around each of those sectors. Well, obviously I can point to the lab. I mean, the lab has had an enormous catalyzation effect. In fact, they worked out that the funding for a lab instrument has been geared 250 times on average. So the money that was put in to develop and implement an instrument has returned 250 times to that. So, I mean, that's been one of the big success stories. But I think there have been other success stories. I mean, another one that is always pointed out, and one that I'm fairly familiar with, is the climate fund manager, the climate investor funds, which have been very successful. They've invested in the sort of billions of dollars across the emerging markets. So there have been a number of very successful programs. But as I said, those are the sort of two that I would point to, but I'm sure there's several others. So, I mean, I obviously am subjective about this, given my involvement in Aegis, but I go to a lot of conferences, and I find that a lot of them don't remain relevant. When I mean relevant is they don't give a lot of thought to the topics, to the speakers, to what they're trying to achieve. It's sort of the same as last year, or maybe a slight variation. So there's a sort of what I call fatigue or sort of boredom factor. But I think where Aegis is far more effective is that, and certainly having been involved in the advisory board and with the people who organize it, there's an enormous amount of thought that goes into the conference, particularly around topics. So each time I think Aegis tries to reinvent itself and remain relevant to what's important on the continent. I think that's number one. And they also have a very wide and diverse members of the advisory board. And I think that's important as well, because they get a lot of insights into what should be discussed, what the sectors are, what the topics are, and the nature of what's discussed. And then also they're very, very important in terms of their contacts. Because once again, it's not only content, but it's the kind of speakers that tend to speak at these conferences, particular Aegis. The other thing I found as well is that nothing is cast in stone. So when we've been going through this development phase, which has now taken several months, we're continuously revising the structure and the way it's run, why the conference is run. So I think that's also a dynamic that's very, very important. So yes, I mean, I think they're keeping it, it's not small, I mean, it's still several hundred people, but it's quite small in relation to some of the other conferences. I suppose I could be slightly controversial, but Africa Oil Week is coming up. And yes, they do have a so-called renewable energy part of it, but it's a very small part of it. So it tends to get lost. So I just think that Aegis, the people who run it, the thought that goes into it, the people who sit on the advisory board, and the quality of the speakers they get, I think each year it remains relevant, it remains popular, it remains an event that people want to go and speak to. For example, the global head of CPI, Barbara Buchner, is coming out to be one of the keynote speakers. And I think, she wouldn't have done that had, it not been an important event for her. Because I look at her calendar, she's speaking in events probably every second week around the world. So, that to me is very much a testament to the fact that, that she regards Aegis, and we regard Aegis as a very important conference. I mean, once again, the impact comes from the topics, the speakers, but also comes from the fact that it's a very engaging conference. So besides the panel discussions, they have fireside chats, they have breakaway groups, but they also have businesses and projects being presented for funding. So it becomes far more interactive, both during the sort of formal parts of it, but also the informal parts of it. And I think, what I've been very impressed with is, let's say, the seniority, the caliber of the people that have attended Aegis. You tend to get people who are far more engaged. And also, I think you get a very wide spread of participants from all the way from, so the thesis is to try and bring together projects, businesses, thought leaders together with investors. And I think they do that quite successfully by having a blend, should I say, of both sides. Whereas sometimes you get too much of the one or too much of the other. Whereas I think there's a good balance between the two. Yeah, so I think what's also very important is that we have chosen Aegis to have our first in-person Africa advisory board meeting. So the Africa Lab, if I can call it that, has been running for 3 years now. It's now going to its 4th cycle. These have always been virtual meetings. So for the first time, and thanks to Aegis and the organisers of Aegis, we're actually having our Africa advisory meeting at Aegis. So I think that for us is a milestone, and once again we've chosen Aegis to have that event. I mean, we didn't necessarily have to have it there, but we very much chose the event for doing so. And I think also that the members of the advisory board, have also seen it as a positive to combine the conference with the advisory board meeting.